Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome today to the National Gallery. Welcome to this lunchtime lecture. I'm Gabriele Finaldi. I have the honour and pleasure of being the director of this house, and I'd like to welcome both of all of our visitors who are here physically present, and also to those who are watching online. I hope that those who are watching online will have the opportunity to come and see the picture which is the focus of my talk in the gallery at some point in the future. I've been director now 2.5 years, and I'm astonished to say this is the first public lecture I've given in this theatre. Not because I'm terrified of the audience, it's just circumstances. The very first lecture I gave here in this auditorium was many, many years ago. I think it was in 1992, devoted to Ribalta and a painting of the 17th century. So I'm now talking about Bellotto in the 18th century, so some progress has been made. The picture I want to talk about is, of course, this work here, the view of Königstein from the north, a picture that the National Gallery acquired in the summer last year. So this has now become part of the gallery's permanent collection. It's there for everyone to see and for future generations to enjoy. It's the first major work by Bernardo Bellotto to have been acquired for the National Gallery. And I think we need to recognize in Bellotto a prominent exponent of the tradition of European view painting, in particular European city painting, in the tradition derived from Caspar van Wittel at the end of the 17th century, Canaletto himself, who was his uncle, as we shall discover in a moment, and Panini, who worked principally in Rome. Of course, the tradition has roots that go back even further. But I think what's very important for Bellotto is that he took this very established tradition of Italian view painting, city painting in particular, and exported it to North and Eastern Europe. Now, Bellotto was the nephew on his mother's side of Canaletto, Bernardo Antonio Canal, known as Il Canaletto. His sister had a child who was Bernardo Bellotto. And Bernardo trained with his uncle in Venice from a very young age, and he enrolled in the Fraglia, or the Guild of Painters in Venice, in 1738, which means by that date, when he was only 16 years old, he was already in a position to sell works in his own right. And clearly the family association with Canaletto was very valuable to him, and no doubt Bernardo Bellotto's presence in Canaletto's studio was also very beneficial to Canaletto himself. You see him here in two of his Northern European paintings. The one on the left, it's a view of Dresden, which we'll see in just a moment, and then the more detailed view on the right, showing him in his great view of Warsaw, dated 1770, as you can see. So in Bernardo Bellotto, we have this wonderful combination of razor-sharp vision, together with the sense of the sweep of the city, or the sweep of the landscape, the sweep of a large scene. And indeed, many of his pictures are indeed very large. The picture that this is a detail of is 2 meters 30 across. That makes it one of his biggest pictures, not quite his biggest, but he worked in several formats, and that was really his large format. So these are large pictures which require a great deal of orchestration of visual effects, of mass and contour, of anecdote in the foreground usually, and then the bigger architectural or landscape sweep in the background. Great control of the effects of light and shadow, and this combination of little stories in the foreground and then the great sweep, as I said, of the setting. Bellotto's career is spent largely outside of Italy. And in a way, that's why I think he's of special interest to us here at the National Gallery. The National Gallery has very good representation of works by Canaletto, both Canaletto working in Venice and Canaletto working in London. But we have very little to show for the tradition of view painting in Eastern Europe, which, as I said before, is where Bellotto focused his activity. So the acquisition of this picture, I think, enables the gallery to extend its boundaries towards the east, towards Dresden, Eastern Germany. Of course, Bellotto's career then goes on and flourishes in Poland, and he settles in Warsaw, where he will eventually die in 1780. So he leaves Venice in 1747, aged 25, never to return. One of his earliest Venetian paintings is a recent attribution. We had this in our collection the whole time without realizing until about 15 or 20 years ago that this was very likely an early work by Bellotto. It used to be called Studio of Canaletto, which I suppose is equally accurate. It was a great challenge in the 1970s and 80s to try and establish what works from the Canaletto studio might be assigned to Bernardo Bellotto, an artist who had developed a very, very strong personality of his own. I think we've moved on quite a bit since then, and we have a much clearer understanding of the early works, the early style of Bellotto. And when I say the early style, we are talking about an artist in his around the age of 20, as I said, when he was already producing independent works. So this is a view of the upper reaches of the Grand Canal. Those of you who know Venice will know that on the left side of the Grand Canal there is where the train station now is. And this work here is closely based on a drawing that can be, with confidence, attributed to Bernardo Bellotto, which is currently in a collection in Germany, in the Darmstadt collection, which has quite an important group of drawings by Bellotto. And just by putting those side by side, you can see how quite a lot of the details match up. It used to be thought that this painting, the one on the right there, was based on a Canaletto view, and ultimately, of course, Canaletto did establish a lot of the essential kind of orthodox basic views of Venice, which other artists then imitated. But I think we can be more specific in the case of this picture and relate it to this drawing, which is a work by Bellotto. You'll see even the staffage and the boats are relatively similar. In particular, you've got the burchiello, the sort of the Grand Canal barge, which carried passengers appearing on the left-hand side of the composition in a very, very similar perspective. And if we look at the picture on the right, I think you can already begin to see some of the characteristics that will emerge in the course of Bellotto's career. He has a preference for these cool, blue, greyish tonalities. If you look at his skies, you quite often see this sort of diagonal striation in the sky, on account usually of the underpainting that he applies in that area of his compositions. You'll also see this glassy surface of the water. There is a sort of Canaletto formula to doing water, which is essentially reflections, a blue base, and then these little wavelets. Well, Bellotto devises his own version of that way of representing water, and it's, generally speaking, has a rather more glassy surface, if I can put it that way, compared to the work of his uncle Canaletto. And then you'll see right from the start, even though this is an early work, you're seeing a sort of great precision in the execution of the buildings to make them, of course, very recognizable. Bellotto marries young in 1741, and in 1742 he undertakes travel in Italy. He goes to Rome, he goes to Florence, he goes to Lucca, and he goes to Livorno. An early source says that he went to improve his style, encouraged by his uncle Canaletto. I'm sure that he was also looking to build up the portfolio for the family business. And he works very extensively in these cities, probably not making many paintings there, but essentially working on producing graphic imagery, which he can then take back to the studio in Venice and then build up into finished paintings. Here are two of the Roman views from 1742, although the pictures, as I say, possibly date from slightly later. On the left, the Porta di Santo Spirito, on the right, the Arch of Titus. So you can see he's wanting to combine a sort of modern bit of the city with an ancient arch on the right-hand side, just adjacent to the Forum. Clearly, these are based on very accurate drawings, on notes he would have taken, and indeed on phenomenal visual memory. Some of these Roman views had previously been painted by Canaletto, particularly the Arch of Titus. There is a model for that picture, but it's very apparent from this work here that Bellotto was studying the view himself anew. And you could even say that there's a stronger sense in Bellotto's painting on the right of the Arch of Titus of the artist actually being there. And one can pick out these sort of little anecdotal details, which I think Bellotto is so skillful in deploying right from the beginning of his career. And they include things like, that sort of very well constructed piece of architecture here with that tiny bit of blue sky appearing in the corner, but also there's the man on a ladder dealing with the tiling on top of the chimney. Here's an example of the kinds of drawings he would have made on this study trip. This is also, of course, a view in Rome. You can recognize the Capitoline Hill on the right and the great staircase leading up to Santa Maria in Araceli on the left. I suppose you'd say it's not a particularly beautiful drawing. It is very much a working drawing. It's a drawing that's going to be useful for him when he comes to make his painting. He's using ruled lines. He's aiming for a very accurate perspective. Quite a difficult one here because you've got these two great staircases leading in different directions, and the impact of the whole, of course, needs to make sense. The careful rendering of detail. The notes which he puts into his pictures, you can just pick up, I think, here in these areas here, più chiaro, lighter. And you will see that in just a moment in the finished painting. There's always a debate as to to what extent Canaletto or Bellotto used the camera obscura. I personally think that it's quite likely that occasional use was made of the camera obscura in order to get these very accurate renditions of quite complicated pieces of urban theatre. This is one of 8 drawings of his Roman views, which are in Warsaw. So clearly he brought these drawings with him. He carried this portfolio of material with him, which was to serve him for the rest of his life, when, of course, Rome was just a distant memory. So this drawing is preparatory for this magnificent painting at Petworth. I referred to those patches on the facade of Santa Maria in Araceli, where he says più chiaro, and you can see very clearly it's those patches there that he's referring to and which he very accurately represents in the finished painting. Clearly there's some perspectival manipulation here. He must have been concerned in the drawing that the Capitoline building on the right looked rather low in the perspective view that he'd taken in his drawing, so he lifts it up slightly so that you get more of a view of the facade. He also includes various details which, of course, don't appear in the painting. That's the people walking up and down the stairs, the pilgrims on their way up to Santa Maria in Araceli, and, of course, one of his favorite motifs, which is the hanging washing, which you'll see time and again in his paintings. Interestingly, this picture is identifiable with a work of this subject which he exhibited in Venice on the feast day of St. Roch. That's the 16th of August in 1743. This was an annual exhibition that would take place at the Scuola di San Rocco. Pictures would be hung on the exterior of the Scuola building and also shown in the interior. And of course, the National Gallery audience is very familiar with this because we have in our collection the spectacularly beautiful Canaletto dating from a few years earlier, 1735, which shows precisely the feast day of St. Roch with the procession with the Doge and the ambassadors coming out of the church of St. Roch on the right, and then on the facade of the Scuola di San Rocco, which is facing us as we look at the picture, you can see a series of paintings hung on its facade. It's a sort of day-long open-air exhibition. Canaletto rather wonderfully manages to paint all these pictures so that we're aware of their sort of subject matter, but very difficult to identify any of them in particular. Because we know the lists of pictures that were sold or that were exhibited on those occasions, we quite like to be able to fix which year it was that Canaletto painted this picture. Unfortunately, we can't. But if you look, for example, at that picture there, I don't have a detail of it, but you can see there's a sort of Canaletto type view of the Grand Canal. And Canaletto himself, like his nephew Bellotto, did exhibit on the facade of San Rocco, of the Scuola di San Rocco, on these annual open-air exhibitions. In 1745, Bellotto was in Turin, and he painted two views of the royal palace for his first royal patron, Charles Emmanuel III, who was both Duke of Savoy and King of Sardinia. This is one of the earliest pictures that he signs. You can probably just make out the top of the signature down there, with his name Bernardo Bellotto, ditto, called Il Canaletto. So he's using his uncle's name already from the mid-1740s. This is a little bit confusing because, of course, their style at this stage is actually rather similar. I think we're in a position now to distinguish between them, but clearly there's a business strategy there to present himself as the artist known as Il Canaletto. My mother, who is of Polish origin, knew all the views of Warsaw in Poland and always thought of Bellotto as being Canaletto. Well, of course, he is Canaletto, and certainly in Eastern Europe, when you say Canaletto, people think of Bellotto rather than our Canaletto. But you can see that the confusion was created by Bernardo himself from quite an early date. When we acquired the picture for the National Gallery, the view of Königstein, there was a label on the picture that said Il Canalettino. Well, I thought this was far too confusing for us and for our public, so we had that label removed. Not the signature on the painting, the label on the frame. So I said in 1745 he's in Turin, so he's acting independently, getting significant commissions from a royal head in Europe. And I particularly wanted to show you this picture because it shows up some of the features that will become constant in his work. And that is the interest in the activity of construction. So you'll quite often see in his pictures scaffolding and labourers at work on walls, battlements, and in other various sort of construction guises. He also likes to include himself in his pictures, so it's very likely that this is Bellotto down here. He's shown with another man lying down on the ground and a priest here. So also this idea of the various estates of contemporary society present in his pictures. The nobles are there, the churchmen are there, the labourers, the beggars also feature in his paintings. In 1746, Canaletto went to London. He made his first trip to London. And immediately afterwards, in 1747, his nephew, Bernardo Bellotto, aged 25, already, as I've said, quite famous in his own right, decided to leave Venice too and make his way to Dresden. So Dresden is the capital of Saxony, which is there. So he becomes court painter to Frederick Augustus II, who is both Elector of Saxony and King of Poland. So I'm going to use his title as Elector of Saxony, which is Augustus III. Okay, stay with me. Augustus III, Elector of Saxony, but also King of Poland. And you can see that Poland also includes Lithuania. So as Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, Augustus III is responsible for this gigantic territory over here. Now, when Bellotto arrives in Dresden, he is the highest paid court artist. This is rather remarkable for an artist who's still so young. He's paid the vast sum of 1,750 thalers a year, but more significant for our purposes, he's given by Augustus III a diamond-studded snuff box with 300 gold louis in it. So these are signals of the importance and the prestige that Bernardo Bellotto carries with him at this stage, early stage in his career. So his career from this moment, as I said before, is completely outside of Italy. It's Dresden first. He will then go on to work in Vienna, very briefly in Munich, back to Dresden, and then finally his last years in Warsaw. So what is it that Augustus III wants from him? Why is he prepared to pay him so much? Why has he attracted him to Dresden? Well, the reason is because Augustus III is creating a new capital. He's building on the achievements of his own father, Augustus II. This is the great new capital of the Saxon state, and the creation of this new city needs to be documented. And you'll see this is probably one of the very first pictures that Bellotto paints for Augustus III. And you can see this, the intention right from the start is to show what a glorious building, what a glorious city is going up on the banks of the river Elbe. As I was saying before, the city had been going a remarkable transformation under Augustus III's father, Augustus II, known as Augustus the Strong, rulers of the House of Wettin. Like Augustus III, his father had also been king of Poland. The Polish monarch was an elected monarch, so it didn't necessarily descend in the family line, but in this case, both father and son were kings of Poland. Augustus II, Augustus the Strong, was very strong. He was famous for breaking horseshoes with his bare hands, and he's reputed to have had between 365 and 382 illegitimate children. I don't think we need to go into that any further. It is rather remarkable. So this is the view of Dresden from the right bank. It's signed and dated 1747, so very early on in his time in Dresden. Bernardo Bellotto, detto il Canaletto in Italian, 1747 in Dresden. And you can see some of the principal buildings of Dresden, many of which, of course, he painted several times. So this is the tower of the palace. Here is the Frauenkirche. This is the picture gallery of the Prime Minister of Saxony, who was called Count Bruhl, who himself was also a very distinguished patron of Bellotto's. And in fact, he tended to commission Bellotto to paint repeat pictures of works which had been made for the Elector himself. And here is the Cathedral of Dresden. Saxony was essentially a Protestant state, but the Elector had decided to become Catholic in order to be able to present himself as a candidate for the Polish monarchy. And so a Catholic cathedral was built in Dresden, and there it is on the banks of the river Elbe, next to the wonderful Augustus Bridge. the Catholic Cathedral, also known as the Hofkirche, which was built, designed by an Italian architect called Chiaveri, who had arrived in the 1730s. So this is the picture I said in which Bellotto introduces himself into. We saw this at the beginning. These other figures have been identified as court artists too. This one is often identified as a court artist called Dietrich, and this man here on the right is likely to be the view painter Johann Alexander Thiele, who, of course, was largely supplanted by the young Bellotto. So in addition to this particular view of Dresden from the Elbe, painted as a pair to it is the view from downriver on the other side of the Augustus Bridge. Here you can see that the bell tower on the Hofkirche has actually advanced very considerably, although we're pretty confident that Bellotto was working from Chiaveri's drawings, because in 1747 we know that the Hofkirche didn't actually have its bell tower built up to that level. But you can see once again the fascination of Bernardo Bellotto for construction and for the activity of builders and architects. Once again, I think you recognize that cool blue-grey tonality of the painting and that glassy surface of the water with these reflections, right, accurately done, of the architectural features of the buildings alongside the river, and then these little wavelets placed over the top. So during that first period in Dresden, until he leaves in 17, we'll come to that in a minute, he paints 14 large views of Dresden. These are 2 meters 30 across, like our own Königstein picture, so these are very substantial pieces of work. 14 views of the city of Dresden itself, before the outbreak of the 7 Years' War in 1756. And he repeats on the same scale practically all of those for Count Bruhl. I'm not going to show you more views of Dresden, but I want to take you out to the town of Pirna. In 1753, so after completing a first batch of views of Dresden, Augustus wants from Bellotto a series of views of the town of Pirna. This is a town which is upriver from Dresden, about 10 miles upriver. And Bellotto paints 11 views of Pirna. They're on the same scale as those Dresden views, so about 2 meters 30 across. They are spectacular sort of mise en scène of these towns on the side of the river. So we're seeing in 1753 in August we have a document where the court is instructing, Augustus himself is instructing the bailiff of Pirna to facilitate his work in the city. And in fact, he paints, as I said, 11 views of the city. So here we're seeing Pirna from the right bank, with this splendid view of the Elbe running through the middle of the picture. The Sonnenstein fortress up at the top of the hill, and then to the right, the Marienkirche, which stands out above the village at the bottom of the Sonnenstein. There's a detail, and here is the view of Pirna from the other side of the river, so we're seeing it downriver. So rather like he'd done with the views of Dresden, he takes this view from across the water, upstream and downstream, to give the sense of the grandeur and the landscape setting of this beautiful, beautiful town. In addition to these very, very broad views taken from the other side of the river, he decides to take some views inside the city, inside the Sonnenstein fortress itself. So here we are high up above the town in the Sonnenstein, and you can see we're along the battlements. where you have these anecdotal elements with soldiers and sentries. Here's an infantryman, here's a cannon being manned by a soldier here on the right-hand side. Here are some people playing cards and so on. It's rather remarkable in what is such a placid rendition, particularly if you look at the river itself, or indeed the town down below. It seems slightly incongruous to have this cannon ready to defend the city. But of course, war actually was quite imminent. There's the detail of the staffage, and there's a detail of the town down below with the Marienkirche on the left-hand side. And I think you get a sense here of the astounding control that Bellotto has of the picture planes, of things which are in the distance, things which are closer to us, of that sense of aerial perspective, and indeed even of weather as you look into the distance of the Elbe Valley. Just a short distance away from Pirna is Königstein. And Bellotto was commissioned to paint a series of views of Königstein, 22 miles southeast of Dresden, further upriver from Pirna. So having completed those 14 large views of Dresden and 11 of Pirna, in the spring of 1756, with a warrant in hand from Augustus III, addressed to Crusius, the bailiff also at Pirna, requiring Crusius to give Bellotto all the support he needed to not stand in his way while he made a series of paintings there. Now, 5 paintings were executed. We don't know how many Bellotto had in mind to produce. With Pirna, as I said, there were 11. But we have 5 paintings of Königstein. His work at Königstein seems to have brought to an abrupt end in August 1756, when Frederick the Great of Prussia invaded Saxony. 3 of these Königstein views are exterior views. They're the 3 at the top, and there are 2 views of the interior of the fortress. We have in the archives in Dresden a receipt for these works at the beginning of 1758, so a few years later. But in fact, the pictures were never delivered. All of these pictures, all 5 of them, ours is the one in the middle, were in Britain before the end of the 18th century and possibly even before Bellotto's death in 1780. Now, the circumstances of these works coming to Britain are unknown to us. I hope that in due course more work will be done and we'll have a clear idea of why this group of pictures doesn't enter the collection of the Elector of Saxony, but instead comes to England. Now, I will come back to this group in a moment, but I just want to continue with Bellotto's career before we come back and focus on the Königstein works. So I said that in 1756, Frederick the Great of Prussia invaded Saxony. The Elector of Saxony immediately left, took refuge in Warsaw. The 7 Years' War, as it became known eventually, was a very, very significant war on the European mainland, with all the European powers participating. It's sometimes called the First Global War, because it was a war that affected the colonies also in Asia and also in the Americas. So it's a very, very important conflict which had huge implications for the development of the European mainland and indeed very significant other bits of the world. So far as Bellotto was concerned, he stayed a little bit longer in Saxony. But in 1759, with Saxony under Prussian occupation and the Elector in Poland, Count Bruhl as well, Bellotto and his family decided to move to Vienna, which is what you see in this picture here. Also one of those large scenes, 230 approximately across, where he worked for the Empress Maria Theresa and for various nobles of the Austrian court. So you're looking at the Belvedere gardens. You can make out the lower Belvedere Palace down here. Here's the Cathedral of Vienna, and here's the relatively recently constructed church of St. Charles Borromeo. These are the Belvedere Gardens here. We're looking at them from the Upper Belvedere Palace. And you can see once again those characteristics emerging of Bellotto's view paintings, this very rigorous geometry, very elegant control of the picture planes, and also this interest in the staffage, or in the anecdotal detail of people and animals in the picture. In addition to working for Maria Theresa, he also worked for several of the highest-ranking aristocrats in Vienna. Here, for example, is the palace of Prince Kaunitz, Prince Wenzel Anton von Kaunitz-Reitberg. On the right is his palace, the Kaunitz-Esterhazy Palace. That's his garden immediately behind him. He's standing, as you can see him, adjacent to the parapet there, looking rather grand. And his secretary beside him, and his dog just to the right. After a relatively short period in Vienna, Bellotto goes on to Munich, and he returns to Dresden in 1762. But of course, in 1762, the situation is rather different from the Dresden that he'd left just a short while before. This is a picture from his first Dresden period. It is a view. It's a view of the Kreuzkirche. When he returns to Dresden in 1762, this is what the Kreuzkirche looks like. The building is in ruins. It's a spectacular view in the city, and Bellotto decides to make something of it, producing, I think, one of his most astounding and surprising Dresden views. He will also turn this into a print, which will become very widely known. During his absence, Bellotto's house had been bombed. He had suffered considerable financial loss. Several of his pictures were lost. Some of his portfolios were lost. So it was a very serious situation for him. This was the oldest church in Dresden, this very large and impressive medieval pile, and had been destroyed by Prussian bombing. It is a sort of lament over the grandiose character of the city of Dresden, nor, of course, would this be the last time that Dresden would suffer terrible destruction and bombing. On his return to Dresden, Bellotto painted two allegories, rather strange pictures. Clearly, I think you can probably say figure painting on this scale was probably not his thing, but these are pictures which relate very much to the situation which he encountered on his return to Dresden. He paints this picture titled Inclinata Resurgit, on account of the inscription that you see at far right. Beaten down, she rises. 1762. The lady in white is obviously Saxonia. She's holding a shield here which bears the arms of Saxony, and she's shown adjacent to two Polish nobles. And I think the picture, which must have had some intended for some decorative function, there is another related work, so he would have worked as pairs or pendants, I think reflects a desire, probably premature at this stage, in the sense that the war was still on, but anyway, for the restoration of Dresden. They're life-size figures, and I think they come from a moment where Bellotto was finding himself increasingly isolated in Dresden. I said before that both Augustus the Third and Count Bruhl were away in Warsaw. In fact, in 1763, both of them die. And he finds that the new artistic situation, let's put it that way, in Dresden, which is really governed by the academy, is a place in which he does not have the same prominence that he had had before. In 1767, then, Bellotto decides to move to Poland to work for the newly elected king, Stanislaus Poniatowski. And as I said before, he will remain in Warsaw until his death. He will paint 26 views of the city and of the suburban palace, the Wilanów Palace. He was extremely well paid in Warsaw too. He was paid an annual salary of 400 ducats, an additional 150 for lodgings, 120 for a carriage, and 120 to go to the theatre. This is his largest view of Warsaw, dated and signed 1770, showing the city from the other side of the river, from the quarter known as Prague. And this is, of course, reminiscent, as you'll have instantly established yourselves, very reminiscent both of the Dresden views and indeed of the Pirna views. This, of course, is not the Elbe, but it is the Vistula river that runs through Warsaw. I said this is even bigger than the pictures that we've seen until now. It's 170 high and 260 across, so as it were a foot wider than the pictures we've been seeing until now. He shows himself in the foreground of the picture. Down here, you'll recognize that's the detail we saw a moment ago, as though he were painting plein air, as though he'd taken out his canvas with him and was working on the canvas actually on the banks of the river looking up towards the city. I suspect there's a certain amount of fiction in this. The usual procedure for Bellotto, as we've seen already, would have been the making of very, very careful drawings and then the elaborating of the picture in the studio. I'm not excluding that some painting was done outdoors, but I suspect that it was mostly done in the studio. Now, you see him here sat by his picture, placed rather low down, as you can see. That's him again up there with the 1770 date very apparent adjacent to his brush. He's wearing a fine wig and is very well dressed. The two men on the left here are almost certainly his son, Lorenzo, who at this stage was working with him, and indeed his son-in-law, who was the royal geographer, Hermann Karl de Perthay. Adjacent to the picture, and you see a detail there, you can see the picture's not in superb physical condition, is the king himself, King Stanislaus Poniatowski, with his left hand pointing towards the city of Warsaw. And then on the right, you can see the king's aide-de-camp, Henryk Butsan, who shortly afterwards was to be assassinated. Now, Stanislaus Augustus is known to us here in London because many of you will remember that the Dulwich Picture Gallery, the founding collection of the Dulwich Picture Gallery, was originally put together by two London dealers with a view to becoming the basis of the Polish Royal Collection, or the Polish National Gallery, intended for Stanislaus Poniatowski. As things turned out, Poniatowski, his kingdom was partitioned by neighbouring powers, and he was eventually sent into exile, and that's why the Dulwich pictures remained in London and never made their way to Warsaw. This picture is part of a suite of views of Warsaw, which you can see in the royal castle in Warsaw. There's a view of the room in which they hang, the Bellotto room. There you can see at the bottom the big picture that we've just seen in some detail. And I just wanted to point out another picture, which is very extraordinary work, showing the election of Stanislaus Poniatowski in September 1764 on the outskirts of Warsaw. So not a scene that Bellotto had himself witnessed. But this is the democratic election of the King of Poland. I mean, democratic, you know what I mean, for the 18th century. It's essentially the Polish and Lithuanian nobles representing the different territories of the crown who have come together in Warsaw to elect Stanislaus Poniatowski. It is completely spectacular, rather crazy picture. And you can see how in the foreground there's a whole series of personalities. Clearly, many of them are meant to be recognizable. But I did just want to focus on the central scene. Clearly, these are recognizable figures. This is not the moment to go into it. But on the far right of the composition, I think we have Bellotto himself appearing in profile. That's him on the far right. And just to complete our Polish episode, this is Miodowa Street of 1777. On the left is the palace of the Bishop of Krakov. Plenty of anecdotal detail here as well. This wonderful detail of prints hung out for sale on a wall adjacent to the street, and a mix of beggars, vendors, soldiers, priests, and nobles. And then just a detail showing the facade of the Capuchin church. And I'm only showing that because that's eventually where Bellotto was buried when he died in 1780. Now, Bellotto by this stage, of course, thought of himself as rather grand, and has himself represented in this way, in this picture here, which is Bellotto himself as a Venetian senator with the golden stole and red robes of a Venetian senator. It's not quite clear why he had himself represented in this way. There's no evidence that he was a Venetian senator, but he was a long way from Venice at this time. But there he appears in this spectacular setting of a capriccio building based on the Sansovino Library in Venice. So Bellotto's invention manifested itself in the kinds of architectural inventions or architectural buildings that he included in his paintings. On the right, as though it's a poster stuck to the column, there is an inscription from Horace's Ars Poetica, which compares painters and poets. It says in Latin, "Painters and poets have always had equal liberty to do the daring." So clearly at this stage in his career, we're in the 1770s now, Bellotto certainly thought of himself as an artist who could display this virtue of inventio in the same way as traditionally writers had done. So let's return just for the last part of my talk to Königstein. So Königstein is the King's Rock. It's a hilltop fortress by the River Elbe. It's the largest hilltop fortification in Europe, of great importance to the Saxon ruling family. It has buildings on it dating from as far back as the early 12th century. In this particular picture, it's viewed from the north. So if we go up in a drone and look at the fortress from up above, we're essentially looking at the castle from this side here, from the north. So I was saying that this is built on a plateau of about 240 meters above the Elbe River. You can see that it's triangular in shape. It covers about 24 acres and holds about 50 buildings. These are the strongest fortifications, as I said before, in Saxony, and were therefore very, very valuable to the ruling house, who had to take cover there on several occasions. They moved their treasury there on certain occasions. They also moved their paintings there. And the Fortress of Königstein has functioned over its history as a monastery, as a palace, as a treasury, as a prison, and as a hunting lodge. Famously, the Fortress of Königstein has never been taken. In 1756, when Frederick the Great of Prussia invaded Saxony, and 17,000 Saxon troops surrendered, they did it at the Lilienstein, which is a bluff just across the water, but not from the fortress itself. Here are some rather spectacular views of the Fortress of Königstein. You're now seeing it from the opposite side. You can see the Elbe River alongside it. And here, this sort of early morning view down below with these battlements viewed front on is very, very remarkable. You'll see that building again in just a moment. One of the features of Königstein, one of the reasons why it was never taken, is because it was self-sufficient in terms of water supply. And you'll see here the great well, the hole which was bored in the 1560s, 152 meters into the ground, which makes it the second deepest well in Europe. Look up the first one on Wikipedia. So this is an aerial view from the north, from approximately where Bellotto set up his easel, or anyway decided to make drawings from the building. So we're looking at Königstein in his painting from approximately the view that you see here. Just to point out a couple of the features that we'll see again. So this is the Georgenberg on the left, and the garrison church, which is there in the middle, just before you reach the wooded area. The garrison church will also appear several times in his paintings. Now, I'm going to place a view of Königstein adjacent to Bellotto's own, and I think you'll be pretty amazed at the accuracy of Bellotto's rendition of the view. With some, I think, concession to drama, these very big shadows that make the fortress look incredibly impressive, I think are very marked in his painting. These tall, craggy rocks that you see here. There's obviously less foliage. There was less foliage in the 18th century than there is now, and also the setting of the fortress against this the blue sky, so silhouetted very sharply against the blue sky. The buildings, as you can see, survive largely unchanged, and here are a couple of examples. Just visible there is this sort of turret-like building. In fact, this is the Friedrichsburg, this late Baroque pavilion. You can see it there with this double staircase in front of it. Or the Hungerturm, the tower which enables access from the lower reaches up to the battlements. So these are very accurate renditions of what the artist had before him, and clearly that's exactly what was required of him by his Augustan masters. But of course, like Canaletto, Bellotto is also very interested in these anecdotal details. So you will find peasants, you will find cowherds, and you will occasionally find priests also sort of peopling the foreground of his pictures. There's the winding road with a carriage along it, and then to the left, but out of view, is the Elbe itself. So farm labourers, villagers, these repoussoir effects, which of course had been learned a long time earlier in the landscapes of Poussin and Claude, where you have a device in the foreground of your picture that gives you a sense of scale and allows you to sort of have something which is close and to give a sense of the buildings or the city or the landscape which extends behind it. So it gives you the opportunity to understand space in the picture. He also includes in this picture demonstrates his interest in the process of building. So here is a protruding bastion known as the flesh, or the arrow, that extends out from the building itself. And it's either being built or repaired. I suspect it's actually being built. We need to find out a little bit more about the sequence of constructions in the Fortress of Königstein. But once again, he includes that tiny little detail of a soldier on the battlements, the sentry. You'll be reminded of the man working in Rome, or indeed the sentries up on top of the Sonnenstein at Pirna. So of the 5 views that Bellotto paints of Königstein, 3 are from the exterior. These are the other 2. This one here was acquired by the National Gallery of Art in Washington. The view is not enormously different from the National Gallery picture. The National Gallery picture is more this side, so there's our little tower, but you're still getting the Georgenberg visible there, and this projecting piece of rock is also apparent in our picture. Here, of course, he's moved round, so this part here corresponds with this part here, and that's, as it were, the rear of the fortress. This work has remained in the collection of Lord Derby at Knowsley Hall, which is where the National Gallery picture was until quite recently. So there's the Washington picture. This was actually separated from the other 4 pictures already in the early 19th century. 3 of them had certainly belonged to Viscount Palmerston, the 3rd Viscount Palmerston, who of course later became Prime Minister. And at some point early in the 19th century, this picture left the Palmerston collection, but remained in Britain. It was only rediscovered in the early 90s. It's rather dramatic, of course, with this big space left aside for the sky, with these winding roads to the left, this foreground scene with cowherds and labourers, and there's the Lilienstein, this great bluff of sandstone, which I referred to slightly earlier. That's the, as it were, the paired view, the one that goes with us, that's still in the collection of the Earl of Derby. And I said before that on several occasions, Bellotto also made prints after his pictures in order to let his paintings be better known. So that's the view that corresponds, of course, to the Washington picture, and that's the view that corresponds, and they're fairly similar. There are some small differences to the Knowsley Hall picture. We needn't go into detail about that, but these are the interior views, and you can see these pictures were acquired for the Manchester City Art Galleries when Tim Clifford was director there back in the early 1980s, on exactly the same scale as the Washington, Knowsley and National Gallery pictures, so about 230 across, but we're now inside the fortress, and you can see here, for example, the commander's house. There's the garrison church tower, the Brunnen house, this sort of walled garden, the muddy street. Down here, a view from the other side of that. You can see the garrison church tower, and this inclusion of washing hanging on the line, which he was always very fond of, as I said. So just to draw to a close then, Bellotto also quite often included cows and cowherds in his pictures. Interestingly, some work done recently shows that these were not necessarily taken from life, but very often based on prints by Paulus Potter and Nicholas Bergham. We're still looking for the exact source for these 2 particular cows here, but I imagine that we're likely to find them. But I think particularly in this picture here, which is not an exclusively urban view, you see Bellotto enjoying that combination of craggy sort of mountainous setting with the sort of forbidding fortress up on top. but then the attractive pastoral setting in the foreground. So just to finish, I have to say we're very pleased at the National Gallery that this picture has been acquired for the National Collection. It does introduce a major work by Bellotto, represented only by a rather modest picture, as you saw at the beginning, into the collection. It also, I think, introduces us to bits of Europe that traditionally we thought of as being rather far away, rather distant, and of course brings them into our viewing experience here at the gallery. The picture was stopped at export when the picture was about to leave the country, and I'm very pleased to say that thanks to the support of various individuals, the Art Fund in particular, I'm sure many of you are members of the Art Fund, the American Friends of the National Gallery, it was possible to acquire it, and the picture went on show at the end of August 2017. It will remain here. Future generations will be able to enjoy it. Please do go and see it after this lecture. It's up in the Barry Rooms, and those of you watching online, I hope you'll quickly have the opportunity to see it here at Trafalgar Square. Thank you very much indeed.